Hello, everybody. My name is June, and welcome to the first Best of All Debate Key Concepts video. Today, we're going to be talking about A2AD, what it is, its relevance to the topic, how you might integrate arguments or concepts about it into your debates on this Baltic states defense commitments topic. So let's hop right in. What is A2AD? Well, it stands for anti-access area denial. A2 because it's anti-access, and AD because it's area denial. And what it is basically describing systems, military systems, weapon systems that can either do one or two things. First is kind of anti-access, and anti-access capabilities aim to prevent adversarial forces from entering the theater of operations. And area denial capabilities aim to prevent those forces from having freedom of action in an area under an enemy's direct control. So let's kind of break those things down a little bit. So anti-access kind of primarily means in kind of an applied way. If we're looking at, for instance, how Russia might use its A2AD capabilities in Eastern Europe on the western half of its country, would probably be to strike ports and airports as part of a larger military invasion. So for instance, maybe strike this port or this airport up here in Estonia, here in Latvia, in Lithuania. Maybe they would strike a port in Poland to make it more difficult for NATO to send maritime reinforcements. All of those things would be within the kind of guise of anti-access capabilities. And area denial capabilities are basically not to prevent the reinforcement of enemy troops, but for enemy troops that are already in an area, or if they manage to get through the anti-access capabilities, for you to kind of harass them, right? A large part about war is to be able to kind of move and maneuver and to navigate terrain so that you can go and accomplish an objective. Well, if you're being constantly harassed by artillery fire, then it makes achieving those objectives much harder. And that's what area denial capabilities are. It's basically, okay, you have troops here. Well, now it's very difficult for you to do what you want. So, why do we talk about A2AD capabilities? And specifically, why do they seem to kind of be growing in importance as a topic of conversation and evidence and think tank conversations and government analyses over these maybe past years? Well, it has been a concept for all of military history, being able to kind of kill somebody from a farther way away or from a farther distance than they can is pretty advantageous in war. Preventing your enemy from going where they want to go is pretty advantageous in war. So these have always kind of been these concepts that have floated around, even if they're not under the A2AD kind of umbrella. However, it took on a growing urgency because of some events during the 90s. So the first use of A2AD as a term happened in 2003, but the events that kind of spurred it as a topic of conversation happened before then. And the first one of those is the Gulf War. And that, for those of you who maybe don't know, the Gulf War was a war fought between the United States and Iraq after Iraq invaded Kuwait. And it was over very quickly. It only lasted 42 days. It lasted from January 17th, 1991 to February 28th, 1991. And the reason why the United States was able to accomplish its military objectives so quickly was because the Iraqi military was unable to stop it from freely maneuvering, navigating, and reinforcing itself. The United States warplanes, launched a very kind of thorough bombing campaign, and it wasn't always precise, oftentimes very far from it. but the Iraqi military was completely unable to stop it. And, as this happens, China is kind of looking around and noticing it, because when the United States goes to war and displays capabilities, the adversaries of the United States take notice, right? They research and look at these kind of things. In 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, China very much could have been next on the dinner plate soon. So then in 1996, during the third Taiwan Strait crisis, President Bill Clinton sent a carrier strike group to Vietnam. And I'm not going to get into the details of what was the third Taiwan Strait crisis, but suffice it to say, the Chinese government was very uncomfortable with the idea of the United States military being able to freely send a carrier strike group very close off the side of its country, right? Because that's, potentially could allow the United States to violate the sovereignty of China, to coerce it. I mean, the United States did have literally, a term in our history books as gunboat diplomacy. And Japan over here is a very famous instance of that. So this is Taiwan, for those of you who don't know. So as you can see, it's very close. And the significance of these island chains is, China over a long period of time, kind of starting in 1991 and 1996, and then now in 2021, has built up very solid A2AD capabilities around its coast to prevent a situation like the third Taiwan Strait crisis from the United States sending a carrier strike group again. And the United States, which is, kind of increasingly shifting away from this period in its history where we just invaded a lot of small countries and kind of trying to do things there. We're beginning to shift more and more and more to this era of what the United States government calls great power competition. And part of great power competition is, if we do want to send a carrier strike group off of the coast of China, that we're able to do it. So one of the ways that the United States is trying to combat these A2AD capabilities that China has is to create its own A2AD capabilities. And so what that looks like is, you might have seen this in the news, this thing called the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, where the plan proposed by the Pacific Commander of the United States Military Forces is to build a chain of precision strike missiles along this first island chain, and then to build a set of ballistic missile defense systems along the second island chain. And both of those things are things that, if they actually do end up happening, though, there's maybe some reason to indicate that they won't happen, would greatly upset China. Both because there are missiles pointing at China, which nobody likes, and then also because it would perhaps prevent China from retaliating in the situation that it does want to, which would change the political calculus of the United States, the fact that China would be able to retaliate. The United States already does have some A2AD capabilities, but it's not really something that we focused on as a military. So kind of an instance of ground-based A2AD capabilities would be the Patriot system, or THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. And then also we have a class of ships called Aegis ships, which are ballistic missile defense ships. And we actually, Boa Debate talks about this in our Maritime Defense Commitments Advantage, because basically right now, they're kind of just like patrolling in the Western Pacific and not really doing that much. And it's actually, in many ways, a net negative, or a lot of people talk about how it's a net negative for the US Navy, because you just have people going back and forth over the same stretch of water for a while, and they don't really we wouldn't really be able to stop that many missiles in the event of some kind of war. And it's very expensive in terms of time, which means that there's more wear and tear on our ships than maybe we expected them to. And also it takes away from the training time of sailors, which has caused accidents and also kind of decreases their skill overall, which is like kind of bad. So that's something we talked about in our maritime defense commitment advantage in the pro brief that we put out that you can check out in our briefs and cards section of our resources. So what's the relevance though to A2AD for this topic specifically? Well, there are kind of multiple points of relevance. The first kind of more obvious one is Kaliningrad, which is the Russian exclave on the border of Lithuania and Poland. It has multiple systems of A2AD capabilities that we're going to talk about in more detail soon. And then the second bit is that having A2AD capabilities is actually very critical to Russian military strategy overall. So the Russian military kind of tends to do one of two things. They either conduct what are called hybrid or gray zone operations, where they'll send in like special forces to kind of achieve an objective in a deniable way. And deniable just means, in fancy policy thinking terms, just means basically like if the United States military or the United States or whoever wanted to call out Russia or anybody using deniable stuff, they want to call them out. It would be very difficult to, right? It would kind of seem like, oh, like, the United States is just making things up. And it would not be enough to kind of like reach the level of needing a military response. And so that's one way to kind of conduct gray zone or hybrid operations. The other way is maybe to fund people who are aligned with your interests in those areas, and then kind of like have them do things, and then you maybe support them kind of from arm's length. So that's one way that the Russian military has in the recent past achieved its objectives. I would want to talk a lot about this to kind of substantiate all of this and to give the subject a lot more nuance, but Russian military actions in Ukraine along its border with Russia would probably count as something like this. The other way that the Russian military kind of does things is overall, like overwhelming first strike, lightning quick kind of operation. An example of this is when Russia, depending on who you ask, either invaded or was invited into Crimea. Regardless, the operation happened very quickly, right? It happened so quickly that in 2014 that Obama basically couldn't really respond. And the reason why he couldn't really respond is because it's not like the Crimean people were just like fighting off Russians and like there's like these people that the United States military could come to aid. It was just that, over a period of about like a week or something along those lines, the Russian military had occupied Crimea. And because it's not like we have all these military bases stationed right outside Crimea, and it was a very chaotic situation, the United States military or the NATO couldn't like just instantly respond. And the reason why it's important to understand why, and if we did respond, it would be very costly. And the reason why it's important to understand that second part of Russian military strategy of doing very quick strikes that are very costly to respond to because the initial operation is so quick is because in a hypothetical situation where Russia decides we're going to invade all the Baltic states, we're just going to like run them over, occupy them, seize that territory, yada, yada, yada. A280 capabilities would be the reason why it would be very costly for NATO to respond. And that's because if Russia was able to very quickly seize the Baltic states, which they probably would be able to, there's not a lot of good ways for the US military or for NATO to respond. So this is Kaliningrad. And then this area right here along the border of Lithuania and Poland and like sandwiched between Kaliningrad and Belarus is called the Suwalki Gap. And what the Suwalki Gap is like a 40-kilometer or something like that long corridor, a very rugged terrain, a very mountainous, hilly, kind of not easily navigable terrain that has like 2 roads running through it, 2 highways running through it. In the event of a Russian invasion, it would be very difficult for NATO to reinforce the Baltic states. And they would need to, if they want to send land troops through land, they would need to reinforce it. And that's because Belarus would very unlikely be involved in the war. It's an ally of Russia, but it is more of a defensive ally than an offensive ally. Belarus knows that in the event where like it goes into an offensive war with Russia, that like it's going to get run over by NATO. 100% absolute chance of that. And then Kaliningrad is like a hard point, right? It's got all of these weapon systems that are designed to make it difficult to get through it, to approach it, stuff like that. And then also it would be difficult to reinforce from the Baltic Sea because of these same A280 capabilities in Kaliningrad and elsewhere in Russia. So the idea being, and this is something that we talk about in our Article 5 breakup scenario, again, that we put out as part of our pro brief, is that simply the NATO leaders might decide that it's not worth the cost of kind of reinforcing and rescuing or liberating the Baltic states, right? Because it could draw them into a much larger war. They might not have the domestic political support. It would be very costly in terms of lives and military hardware. So they might just say it's not worth the effort. So in the event that Russia does try to seize all of the Baltic states, and we can have a debate about whether or not that's likely, this would be why they would think they could do it, is the fact that they have these anti-access area denial capabilities that could first strike, take out kind of ports and airports. So it's more difficult for NATO to reinforce the Baltic states. And then as more troops kind of come in, to make it more difficult to reinforce by like constantly harassing them. And then even if they were to get inside the Baltic states, they would still be under very large and constant missile fire, artillery fire, etc. So that's why that's kind of the background of a lot of these full-scale Russian military invasion pieces of evidence, whether or not you knew it, and that background's important. There are some things that you should keep in mind, though. The first is that A280 capabilities are aspirational. There are hard limits to them. Up until this point, I've painted kind of maybe a pretty negative picture, pretty bleak picture for the Baltic states and for NATO, and a pretty rosy one for Russia. But just because there's a red circle on a map does not mean like, oh my God, NATO can't go there. Troops would be instantly destroyed. It's not like some kind of laser force field, right? There are hard kind of material processes. The missile has to be launched from someplace. It has to go to someplace. There are very hard limits to the software and the hardware capabilities of these systems. Defense systems can be overwhelmed. Some of them have very limited kind of engagement tracking systems, and the thing that like tells the system to like what to shoot. They have a very finite amount of munitions. Missiles are and artillery shells and anything in the military is very expensive to build. And in many ways, Russia is still a very poor country, even if it's kind of economically stronger than it was right after the Soviet Union fell. So these are things that maybe indicate that NATO would have a chance. Now, as part of that, the idea of like, oh, well, to beat these A280 systems, we just need to send like a bunch of jets and like, yeah, some of them are going to get shot down, or we just need to make it so they run out of like munitions. That's a very hard sell to like the public of a country. And this is, again, something that the Russian military knows, right? So even if it's not a perfect defense system, right, there is no such thing as a perfect defense system, it still could maybe accomplish the objective that it needs to. Because if you can take over the Baltic states or whatever other country very quickly, and you can make it so like the allies of that country don't want to respond, then it doesn't really matter if the defense systems can be overwhelmed. It doesn't really matter if there's a finite amount of munitions. Though it does matter in the sense that if it was perfect, then they would probably have invaded, much sooner. Or they, again, we can have a debate about that, and you probably should. But another part of this is that A280 capabilities are often overstated. So their capabilities depend on the target. For instance, the S-400, which is like kind of the boogeyman of a lot of these think tanks, has a range against high altitude, slow targets. So it's a ground to air missile defense system. It's like anti-aircraft. Against high altitude, slow targets, it has a range of 120 to 150 miles, which is pretty good. But against low altitude, fast moving aircraft, so like fighter jets and things like that, it only has a range of 12 to 22 miles, which means that, it would maybe be a little bit easier for NATO military operations to kind of do what they want to do in these areas. Now, it's still important that it has a very large range against high altitude slow targets, because a lot of those kinds of planes tend to be like the support units and kind of like backup to the fighter jets and like other things on the ground and help support them. So that's still important, but it's not as if, the S-400 can do whatever it wants at any range against any target. Another kind of instance of where the capabilities might be overstated is that a lot of these things depend on what's called a kill chain. And what a kill chain is basically, as I said before, that these things are material processes. You need to be able to track a target. You need to be able to transmit the data from the thing that's tracking the target to the weapon system. The weapon system, needs to be able to thing that can fire, and then that missile needs to then be able to like continuously track the target, right? So that's a chain of events, and these things can happen very quickly, and obviously they do happen very quickly because it's the military, and it's war. But if you can disrupt a part of that chain, well, then suddenly that's less of a threat, which makes it, again, a little bit less of a total defense. And then also some of these things have not great kind of capabilities on their own. So for instance, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, but the Bastion P anti-ship missile systems have a nominal range of 180 miles. That's how far their missiles can shoot. But because of the curvature of the Earth, they can only on their own capabilities basically shoot as far as the horizon, which means that they need there to be other radars, other tracking systems in areas that they're trying to shoot if they want to shoot a ship. So that would require either like a forward placed radar, or it would require that's able to transmit securely that information, or it would require like an airborne radar, which again would have to securely transmit that information. And the problem is that the Russian military hasn't really like displayed those capabilities yet, which means that it's a lot more difficult, perhaps, than at first if we take these things at face value for the Russian military to like completely shut down any kind of maritime reinforcements. And then these things are also mostly untested, right? There's not been a war between Russia and NATO. And the Russian military has sold specifically the S-400 system, a slightly outdated version of it, to the Syrian government. And the Israeli Air Force has kind of engaged with that weapon system before. They were using like F-15s and F-16s, which are also not the most up-to-date generation of aircraft. And they came out pretty well. As far as the evidence shows, I think like only one of them got destroyed, but they destroyed like a lot of these systems over time. So the evidence, on the ground indicates that maybe these things aren't even as good as we think they are. However, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't take them seriously. And then to kind of again give you a little bit more visual representation of these things, this is the area that the bastion can engage based off of its own radar, but this is like how far it can shoot its missile, right? So basically what you see here is like, oh, well, the bastion can protect pretty well the area very directly around Kaliningrad, but it's not like it can't prevent any reinforcements on its own from entering or navigating in the Baltic Sea, which is probably an indication that, again, the chances of the Russian military invasion plan going perfectly as planned is not as good as people have thought. Now, that doesn't mean that these things aren't very dangerous. It doesn't mean that maybe the Russian military has just been hiding these capabilities until it does launch an invasion, right? But it also doesn't mean that it's like, wow, how come the Baltic states aren't invaded yet? Things that need to be considered. So how would you run these things on the topic? There are a few ways. So on pro, I think this first bit is kind of more of a jack of all trades case. I think it's something that if you're really worried about running into A2, AD arguments and having answers that, or like you just kind of want something that no matter what round, no matter what negative arguments people are running, like you would have an answer to them, is this idea around resilience, which is becoming an increasingly important concept in NATO planning documents. And what resilience means is really just if adversaries try to do something, we're capable of like withstanding it. We have resilience against their actions. And there are lots of different domains where this can happen. So for instance, societally / culturally, this isn't directly related to A2AD, but to give you an idea of how many different kind of parts of life that this can deal with. The Baltic states have a very large Russian-speaking population, both because they've historically been part of Russia, and then also they were part of the Soviet Union, which meant there was a lot of migration. And then when the Soviet Union fell, all of these Russian-speaking citizens, all these Soviet Union citizens were stranded, right? So they have a very large Russian-speaking population, especially in certain parts of the country. And in the past, the Baltic states were like pretty outright discriminatory towards the Russian speakers, which caused a lot of resentment. Now over time, they've gotten a little bit better about them. They're a little bit more integrated into these Baltic state societies. There's less discrimination against the Russian language. And part of that is because basically they were worried that, the Russian government might be able to exploit this kind of thing and foment unrest or kind of like put fuel on the fire and like maybe send arms and get a little bit more territory by exploiting these Russian-speaking populations. So again, the Baltic states are not angels in this situation. Militarily, what resilience would look like would be not basically having bases and important military stockpiles like all in one place, investing in capabilities that make them mobile or maybe make them resilient to strikes or put them in a very large area. Cyber resilience would basically just be improving cyber defense capabilities, both for kind of domestic civilian stuff, so make it harder to like hack into newspapers, and also like military capabilities. Physical kind of resilience, it would be something along the lines of, for those ports and airports, investing in the infrastructure a little bit more to make it harder for those decapitating first strikes to actually succeed. Economic resilience here, I don't really mean anything that has to do with necessarily trade or even like energy security. I know that's an argument on this topic. What I'm talking about is more along the lines of the fact that a lot of these ports, all these airports are privately owned, like a very large portion of them are privately owned, but they also have military use and military capabilities in the event of an invasion. So there's some worry basically that like having them be in private hands means that their upkeep might be worsened, or that maybe a country that's not allied to NATO, but the owner is like from a country that's not allied by NATO, could perhaps do something that would be negative to the chances of like reinforcing. So for instance, and we talk about this in our con advantage that we're going to be putting out tomorrow on Friday. We talk about it where basically China, a state-owned company or a company that's very closely linked to the Chinese state, owns parts of ports in like the Baltic states. And there are some people that are like, oh, like we need to be worried about this. You can have a debate about whether or not that's true. The other kind of, or another way to kind of counter this, or like if you're worried about A2AD capabilities, to talk about it. And I think these things work as a standalone argument, but they do counter, again, this thing that's a background of a lot of arguments on this topic, again, whether or not people realize it, is that just arguments about ensuring access. And as we talked about before, this would basically either be through maritime ways, through the Baltic Sea, which is what we talk about in our maritime defense commitments advantage that we put out in the pro brief, or it would be through reinforcing through the Suwalki gap. Now, you can, for like synergistic reasons or for thematic reasons, run both of these arguments, but you actually don't need to if we're talking about this in like the most technical sense. And that's because, as I already explained, you know, the Russian military calculus is, well, if we have these A280 capabilities and we can, you know, strike very quickly and very fast and take out any kind of resistance, then, you know, NATO maybe doesn't want to reinforce, or then NATO doesn't want to reinforce. Well, if you can make sure that like Russia can't take the Suwalki Gap or Russia can't block off maritime access, then it doesn't matter if they can, you know, block off the Suwalki Gap but not block off maritime access, or if they can block off maritime access but not block off the Suwalki Gap, because they would still know that NATO would be able to reinforce. And in the political calculus or in the decision calculus, that would mean like, okay, well, we don't want to invade anymore. That's very rough. We're going to be including an article in the description / on the WordPress page that's going to be basically describing a way to think about Russian military strategy, a way to think about like tempo and time and why that's important, to maybe give you a better background on this. The last bit would be about preventing denial, active measures and passive measures. Active measures basically just mean put more ballistic missile defense systems in the Baltic states, so things like the Patriot system or things like THAAD, to make it harder for the Russian military to do a decapitating first strike against these ports, against these military bases, against these airports. Those would be active measures. Passive measures would be more along the lines of things like camouflage, or this kind of goes back to resilience, but also like things like very mobile military systems. That way, it would be more difficult for the Russian military to do some kind of first strike, because they would first require to know where these things are. So that's what a passive measure is. For all of these, we are going to be including, again, in the description or on the page, BOA debate page itself. It's going to be an article titled Beyond Bursting the Bubble, which is like 118 or something like that page set. It's a set of papers written by a bunch of different people from, I believe it's the Sweden National Defense Agency, but I actually might be wrong about that. That basically just gives recommendations for how NATO or other people might kind of stop or circumvent Russian A280 capabilities. There's lots of good stuff in there. I haven't read all of it, but these are all things that you could definitely find and talk about in your debate on the pro side. Now, on the con side, I have a little bit less here. And that's because obviously we're not kind of like role playing as the Russian military when we're on the con side, which means it's less about like, okay, well, we're going to be trying to overcome the little bit of capabilities that NATO has about A280. But these are things to keep in mind when you're running up against pro arguments. The first is that A280 is very good against generics. It's great against generics. And that's because for those of you who maybe don't know, if somebody is running the argument of, okay, well, we're just going to send 4 more enhanced forward presence battalions to the Baltic states, and that solves the chance of, Russia going to war with Baltics. Well, that's not true at all. The Russian military, I think there's 3 battalions. I might be a little bit wrong about that. Enhanced forward presence battalions in the Baltic states. It's not a lot of troops. The Russian military has a lot of troops, has a lot of technology. The point of the enhanced forward presence battalions is almost kind of the opposite, the other end of the Russian political calculus, where the point of it is that, well, these are going to serve as a tripwire, and this is literally a word that's used in the literature. But these enhanced forward presence battalions serve as a tripwire, so that basically, if Russia goes to war against the Baltic states, full-scale invasion, troops from all of the NATO countries are going to die, and that is going to make it easier to drum up political support back home. And the reason why NATO does that is not maybe necessarily because they want these people to die, but more along the lines, so it's another thing that the Russian military, the Russian government has to be thinking about, right? Because if there were no troops in the Baltic states and Russia invaded, then it would probably be a lot harder, or at least harder, to drum up domestic political support. So go through a bunch of missiles raining down and artillery raining down, and troops dying in very mountainous terrain, getting shot by tanks and all this kind of stuff. And it's going to be very expensive in terms of human life and military capabilities. It would probably be very hard to drum up support for that. While it's a little bit easier probably to drum up support for Russia killed some of our soldiers, let's go and kind of repay them a favor and also rescue the Baltic states, right? That's probably a little bit easier to talk about. So the reason why this is good against generics is because it does not matter how many troops, how many enhanced forward presence battalions are in the Baltic states, because the point of those battalions is not to stop the Russian invasion in the sense of physically stopping it. They are to serve as a tripwire, and when you trigger a tripwire, you break it, right? That thing is going to be damaged, but the reason why you do it is because it allows something larger, a boulder, 2 wooden hammers coming together, whatever, to come down. So A280 arguments kind of circumvent that, because again, it's not about the more enhanced forward presence battalions, more troops on the ground in the Baltic states does not change the political calculus. Moving on, it's good against smaller impacts, and what I mean by this is arguments like kind of energy security. The argument for energy, and it's good against smaller impacts, but it's not great. It's not as great as it is against generics. And the reason why it's good is because the essence of those arguments is oh, well, Russia can't coerce the Baltic states as easily anymore, or through energy means. And the A280 arguments kind of, again, circumvent this, because the idea behind maybe Russia wanting to coerce these states is that it allows them to get something that they want from the Baltic states. But if they can just take a bite, if why would you take a bite out of the apple when you could eat the whole apple, kind of situation, right? So getting more energy security for the Baltic states definitely does something, right? And it does something in a way that the enhanced forward presence battalion impacts don't do. But it still doesn't really maybe answer some fundamental questions or to fundamentally improve the defense of the Baltic states. Though I definitely think you are in a little bit better of a position. Like, I think you totally could win some energy security arguments or some smaller arguments against A280 arguments, because you would basically just need to win the idea that Russia won't invade the Baltics, and therefore this is still like a net positive. But at the same time, I think maybe you're coming out of the gates a little bit far behind, and that's something that A280 is good about. It's also good as a trick, and by trick I don't mean really fooling somebody. I mean kind of a tool in your arsenal. And this is something that what I'm going to describe to you happens very often in policy debate, because we have the words significant and substantial in our topics a lot more often, which means that, for instance, on the China topic, it was about diplomatically and economically engaging with China. There were a lot of arguments about how, well, that means Japan gets freaked out, they develop nuclear weapons, and then that causes proliferation, and then there's like a nuclear war. And it was useful on the China topic because some people would try to make the argument of like, oh, well, this isn't very, they wouldn't say this isn't very significant, but they would be like, Japan doesn't care. So the argument would always be, it was very fun, is you would say, okay, you know, is this a significant action? And they would say, well, yes, because they needed to, because otherwise they wouldn't be topical. And then you would say, okay, they say it's significant, we won't run like topicality, but because it's significant, then that means Japan will definitely get upset. And you make similar kinds of arguments here. So the argument would basically maybe be structured around the idea of like arms race or escalation, and it being like either the defense commitments are not enough to cause an arms race or escalation, and therefore they don't do enough to stop A280 capabilities, or they do enough to stop A280 capabilities and it causes an arms race slash escalation. And I think that's maybe kind of a complicated debate. It's definitely not something you would necessarily do in every single round, but I think for unprepared teams, it could definitely be an advantage, especially if they fall for the trick, right? I think it's a lot better to concede that this maybe causes an arms race or escalation versus you don't do anything against A280 capabilities. That seems like maybe a slightly better kind of a way to debate, but it's definitely something that teams would maybe get tripped up on, or that you could, that's the thing that ekes out a win. So that's how we think that you could run these arguments on the topic. I hope you liked the video. If you did, please like and subscribe. If you're on YouTube, if you are on WordPress right now, if you kind of go down a little bit, you're going to see something that looks a little bit like that. And if you type in your email address, you're going to be automatically updated whenever we make a post. And then, you know, if you want to follow us on our social media as well, we would really appreciate that. In the future, you know, we're going to be having more key concept videos that you'll be able to see on YouTube. We might stream evidence cutting sessions and things like that. You can follow us on Reddit and Twitter to make sure, have another avenue to make sure that you know when we post a video. But if you have any questions, if you have any comments about anything that I've talked about, I would be more than happy to answer them or to talk to you about them. And keep an eye out tomorrow, Friday, for our new con evidence that we're going to be dropping, our new con advantage, and that's going to be about a turn to China. You know, don't do this stuff in the Baltics because it prevents us from, or it prevents NATO from kind of focusing on China. And that should be very interesting. And we'll post a video too talking about that as well. I hope you have a nice day or a nice night.